Back in the 1950s, when the Republicans started this whole, oh my God, we can't have too much public debt, we can't have too much, a national debt and deficit in our election, and they put into law that there was a ceiling to the public debt. This was not something that's like in the Constitution or anything, and then they've used that as a club, basically, to beat up Democrats with over the years, repeatedly. Democrats tend to ignore it. And now they're threatening to do it again, to shut down the government over the debt ceiling. And if they do, it could have some serious consequences. So let's check in with Professor Richard Wolff, the economist and co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His latest, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, also available now as an ebook, rdwolff.com with two F's also, and Prof Wolff is his Twitter handle. Professor Wolff, welcome back. So what do we do? What is the story here? What, the debt ceiling? I mean, I gave a little bit away in the setup, I suppose, but we have this debt ceiling. If you could explain that, and then what happens if the Republicans stay true to this threat that they're making, that they're going to refuse to raise the debt ceiling?
Well, first of all, the debt. Every year, the government of the United States, like every other government, has to raise money with taxes and spend money for all the things that the government is expected to do. A problem arises if the spending that the government wants to do is larger than the taxes it feels it can reasonably take from its private businesses and private individuals. When that happens, when the spending is more than the taxes, it's called a deficit. And all that means is the government has to get the money somewhere else because it hasn't raised the taxes enough to cover the spending. And when it does that, it goes out and borrows money from whoever is willing to lend to the United States government. And that's simply how the national debt accumulates over time. American governments have been doing that from the beginning throughout our history. You're absolutely right. In recent decades, the Republicans have found it a convenient story to tell as if it were something new or as if it were something scary, et cetera, et cetera. Over the years, as the United States, mainly across the 20th century, became the global powerhouse economy, its debt, the debts of the United States government, came to be looked upon around the world as the most secure way to hold wealth. It could not be taken away by your own government if you lived in another country. It wasn't subject to the ups and downs of the economy. It was a kind of debt that Uncle Sam had committed himself to pay you. And what that meant was that anybody who's wealthy enough to worry about it keeps a portion of their company's wealth or their individual wealth or even their country's wealth in the form of debts of the United States government. Now let's fast forward to the present. We are currently running deficits larger than any in the peacetime history of the United States. We're currently, as I speak, running a deficit roughly around $3 trillion. In other words, the government is spending money beyond what it raises in taxes to the tune of $3 trillion, which therefore it has to borrow. And now here comes the problem. There's a legal ceiling. Because the Congress did, as you explained, set a limit. You can't borrow more than X trillion dollars as a government. They are now bumping up against the ceiling. And if, in fact, the Republicans carry out their threat this time, mostly these are empty threats, but if they carry it out this time, then suddenly the government cannot borrow anymore because it's reached the ceiling. But if it can't borrow, then it can't spend on all kinds of programs that it needs the money to spend on. And then the government is going to be in a very sticky situation, which is why the Republicans enjoy this, because it will be blamed, they hope, on Mr. Biden and the Democrats as they figure out who's going to not get spent on. Are we going to, for example, stop sending checks to the Social Security people? Are we going to stop funding the airports that the government sustains? Are we going to, for example, not pay the interest to all the folks who own the American debt and who are therefore entitled to the interest payments? Are we going to tell them you're not going to get your interest payment? If we ever dare do that, then you can bet the next time the government needs to borrow money, people around the world who used to give the government that money won't do it anymore, and that could have terrible consequences. I mean, let me drive the point home. You would have had to raise taxes in America by many, many thousands of dollars on every American for the last 20 years if Americans had paid for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The government was able to pay for a large portion of them, not by taxing Americans, but by borrowing the money. But if you do that, then you're going to bump up against the ceiling, all of which the Republicans don't want to tell you. And likewise, they don't want to tell you that the biggest boost to the debts of the United States was the decision under Mr. Trump, passed in the Congress in December of 2017, when he gave back the taxes that they had all paid. And so it is really a kind of sleaze to now say, gee, there's a terrible deficit and we have to impose the ceiling, when it was the Republicans who bear at least as much responsibility for this deficit and these debts as anybody else.
So if the Republicans were successful in blocking this, and we've seen this happen before, you know, they quote, shut down the government. Newt Gingrich started this back in the 90s as a way of beating Bill Clinton over the head. But if they did it long enough, doesn't it have the potential to crash the economy? And might not
Absolutely.
that be exactly what they want to have happen, so that Democrats will be blamed for, you know, the Great Depression of 2021 or whatever? And if so, how would that work? The crashing of the economy?
Well, you know, there it depends on how the Biden government would react. In other words, if they couldn't borrow the amounts of money that they had planned on, because this ceiling was really made a reality by the Republicans, then the Biden administration would have to figure out, okay, who's not going to get spent on? And I meant it what I said before. Are you going to take back money that you were going to give to Social Security recipients? Are you going to cut the budget for all the other things the government does? Are you going to close the COVID vaccination program? What is it you're going to do? And I think the Republicans are enjoying the prospect of putting Mr. Biden in such a pickle, because no matter where he cuts, the people affected, which could be all of us, are going to be upset and angry, and the Republicans are calculating that most of them will blame the government doing the cutting rather than the Republicans imposing. But if they didn't cut at home because it's too politically dangerous, but said to the people around the world who own the debt of the United States government, okay, we can't borrow anymore because we've hit the ceiling, so we're not going to pay you back the way we had promised. We're not going to pay you interest. People should understand the United States is the largest debtor country in the world, and it needs to be able to borrow more than any place in the world because that's how it organizes its economy. And if it were unable to do that, we're in a whole new ballgame of what will happen in this economy if the government cannot borrow the vast sums that are keeping it going. I mean, we have to face, although I know it's difficult for Americans, that we're now an economy on government life support, and that life support is borrowing, and the Republicans are playing with a very dangerous fire.
Yeah, and all 8 years of the Bush administration, all 4 years of the Trump administration, they just routinely raised the debt ceiling. It wasn't even an issue.
Absolutely.
There you go.
Absolutely.
Professor Richard Wolff, thank you so much. It's great talking with you.